December 15, 1945, Washington. A thin winter light filters through the tall windows of the U.S. Treasury Building. Inside, the air smells faintly of paper, ink, and coal smoke. Clerks move quietly through corridors lined with filing cabinets, heavy with the weight of empire. Balance sheets, shipping manifests, ledgers recording the slow migration of global power. Across the Atlantic, London is still dark. Bomb sites scar the city. Coal shortages choke the streets. Ration books govern daily life. Britain has won the most destructive war in human history, yet it is nearly broke. At the center of this moment stands a simple question, never asked aloud, but understood by everyone in the room. What is victory worth when you can no longer afford it? The war is over. Nazi Germany lies in ruins. Japan has surrendered. The British flag still flies over vast territories, from the Caribbean to Asia. On paper, Britain remains an empire. But in reality, something fundamental has changed. Because the empire no longer controls the most important battlefield of all, money. The paradox. Britain did not lose the Second World War. Militarily, it stood undefeated. Politically, it sat among the victors. And yet, within a single generation, the British Empire would dissolve, its global dominance transferred, not through conquest, but through contracts, loans, and conditions written in quiet rooms thousands of miles from the front lines. At the center of this transformation was a number that seemed almost modest: $3.75 billion. A loan agreed to in 1946 between the United States and the United Kingdom, presented as financial assistance, framed as post-war cooperation. But embedded within it was a mechanism that would quietly dismantle Britain's economic independence, its trade system, and its imperial structure. This is not the story of a battlefield defeat. This is the story of how financial architecture replaced military conquest, and how the global order shifted without a single shot being fired. Setting the stage. To understand how this happened, we must return to September 1939. Britain enters the war as the wealthiest nation on Earth. The British Empire controls nearly a quarter of the planet's land and population. The pound sterling functions as a global reserve currency. British overseas investments generate enormous annual income. Gold reserves sit safely in vaults beneath London. But Britain is about to discover a new reality of modern war. It is no longer enough to have factories, colonies, or fleets. You must also have liquidity. And Britain does not control the world's liquidity anymore. That power now resides in the United States. The architects. Across the Atlantic, a different set of figures is shaping the war's financial future. In Washington, Henry Morgenthau Jr., U.S. Treasury Secretary, believes that Britain's imperial trade system must not survive the war. To him, British economic dominance is incompatible with America's vision of a post-war world built around free trade and the U.S. dollar. At the White House, Franklin D. Roosevelt walks a careful line. Publicly, he speaks of partnership. Privately, he understands leverage when he sees it. And in London, Winston Churchill, defiant in rhetoric, is increasingly constrained by arithmetic. Britain is fighting on credit, and the bills are coming due. Hovering behind them all are American banks, shipping firms, industrial corporations, and policymakers who recognize something unprecedented. For the first time in history, the dominant global empire is financially dependent on another nation to survive a war. And dependency always comes with conditions. The first mechanism, cash and carry. When war breaks out, the United States declares neutrality. But neutrality does not mean charity. Under the Neutrality Acts, Britain can buy American weapons only under cash and carry terms. Pay up front. Transport the goods yourself. No credit. No delay. No exceptions. Britain begins selling gold. Then securities. Then overseas investments. Assets built over generations are liquidated at fire sale prices. American bankers are not surprised. They know Britain has no alternative. The empire bleeds quietly, not on battlefields, but in balance sheets. The moment of collapse. By December 1940, Britain reaches the edge. Churchill writes to Roosevelt with unprecedented honesty. We are broke. What follows is not immediate relief, but scrutiny. Morgenthau demands a full audit of Britain's finances. Britain must prove it has exhausted every resource before aid is granted. Gold is shipped across the Atlantic. Investments are sold. Even British-owned companies on American soil are liquidated. Only then does assistance arrive. In March 1941, the U.S. Congress passes Lend-Lease. It is often remembered as generosity. In reality, it is leverage. Embedded deep within the agreement is Article 7, a clause requiring Britain to dismantle its system of imperial trade protection after the war. No tariffs. No preferential markets. No economic shield for the empire. Britain accepts. Because Britain has no choice. The war continues. Britain survives. Victory eventually comes. And then, almost immediately, the terms change again. Just 7 days after Japan's surrender in August 1945, the United States abruptly terminates Lend-Lease. Supply ships already at sea are ordered to turn back. Britain is cut off overnight. The war is over. The dependency remains. What follows is not reconstruction, but negotiation. A negotiation between a victorious empire that lacks money and a creditor nation that now controls the global financial system. The result will be a loan, a number, a signature, $3.75 billion. And with it, the quiet end of the British Empire, not through defeat, but through design. In 1939, Britain did not look like a declining power. The British Empire still spanned continents. Its navy controlled sea lanes. Its financial reach extended through banks, insurance firms, shipping companies, and investment trusts embedded across the world. More importantly, Britain was not merely rich, it was liquid. Gold reserves exceeded $4 billion overseas investments, totaled roughly $20 billion British foreign assets, generated nearly $500 million. Annually the pound sterling functioned as a global reserve currency. London was not just a capital, it was the nervous system of global finance. But modern war consumed resources faster than any empire could replenish them. Britain was fighting an industrial war using 19th century financial assumptions in a world that had already shifted. That shift had a name: America. The neutrality trap, cash without credit. When war began, the United States officially remained neutral. But neutrality did not mean passivity. Under U.S. neutrality acts, Britain could purchase weapons only under cash and carry rules. Pay upfront, transport the goods, yourself, no loans, no credit. At first, Britain complied easily. Gold was shipped. Dollars were transferred. Then, the numbers stopped adding up. As the war dragged on, Britain began liquidating long-held overseas investments, often at distressed prices. American buyers knew Britain had no leverage. Companies built over generations changed hands in months. One example became symbolic: American Viscose Corporation. Valued at roughly $100 million, it was sold for $54 million, barely half its worth. There was no negotiation. Britain needed dollars now. The empire was being sold piece by piece to fund its own survival. Operation Fish, the flight of gold. By 1940, Britain feared something worse than bankruptcy: invasion. Under Operation Fish, Britain secretly transported its gold reserves and critical securities across the Atlantic to Canada and the United States. Crates were loaded under cover of darkness. Convoys sailed under threat of German submarines. It became the largest physical transfer of wealth in history. By the end, nearly $4 billion in gold, the financial foundation of the British state, was no longer under British control. Britain still ruled an empire, but its monetary anchor now sat in North America. We are broke, December 1940. By December 1940, the situation became unavoidable. Winston Churchill wrote directly to Franklin Roosevelt, "The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies." Behind the scenes, U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. was unmoved by appeals to sacrifice or alliance. Before aid, Morgenthau demanded proof. Britain must demonstrate total financial exhaustion. American officials conducted audits. British assets in the United States were identified, valued, and, where possible, sold. Securities were liquidated. Remaining gold transferred. Only when Britain had nothing left to sell did Washington move. Lend-Lease, assistance with conditions. In March 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. Public memory treats it as generosity. In practice, it was conditional support. At the heart of the agreement sat Article 7. Britain committed that after the war it would abolish imperial preference, open colonial markets to foreign competition, dismantle protective tariffs within the empire. This was not about wartime logistics. It was about the post-war order. Britain accepted because refusal meant collapse. From that moment forward, the empire was fighting for military survival while conceding economic sovereignty. Bases for destroyers, geography for scrap. In 1940, Britain transferred strategic Caribbean and Atlantic bases to the United States under 99-year leases. Newfoundland, Bermuda, Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, Antigua, British Guiana. In exchange, Britain received 50 obsolete World War I-era destroyers, ships the U.S. Navy no longer wanted. The exchange was symbolic. Permanent strategic geography for temporary wartime hardware. Empire was becoming negotiable. Victory, then cut off, August 1945. The war ended in August 1945. Victory came. So did the bill. Just 7 days after Japan surrendered, President Harry Truman abruptly terminated Lend-Lease. Ships already crossing the Atlantic were ordered to turn around. Supplies were halted without warning. Britain was stunned. There would be no transition period, no grace window, no continuation of support. The alliance had been wartime only. Peace meant accounting. Keynes goes to Washington. In September 1945, economist John Maynard Keynes sailed to Washington. His mission was simple: secure Britain's survival. Keynes argued Britain had sacrificed disproportionately, financially, militarily, morally. He requested a $6 billion grant, not a loan. A settlement reflecting Britain's role in defeating fascism. The American response was swift. No grants. Only a loan. The $3.75 billion loan with strings attached. In 1946, the United States offered Britain a loan of $3.75 billion at 2% interest. On the surface, it seemed generous. The conditions were not. Key requirement: sterling convertibility within 1 year. This meant anyone holding British pounds anywhere in the world could convert them freely into US dollars. The risk was obvious. Britain had accumulated enormous wartime sterling debts to colonies and allies. Convertibility would trigger a run. But Britain had no alternative. The loan was accepted. The convertibility crisis, 1947. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound convertible. The result was immediate. Within 5 weeks, over $700 million fled the country. Britain burned through 20% of the loan almost instantly. On August 20th, convertibility was suspended. The damage was permanent. Britain had demonstrated vulnerability. Markets remembered. In 1949, Britain took the final step. The pound was devalued by 30%, from $4.03 to $2.80. Overnight, imports became more expensive, wages lost purchasing power, living standards fell sharply. The empire's currency had fallen. The dollar had replaced it. 60 years of payment. From 1946 to 2006, Britain made annual payments on the loan. Interest doubled the original amount. Borrowed. $3.75 billion total paid. $7.50 billion final payment. December 29, 2006, $83.25 million. But the loan was only the visible cost. The real cost was structural. Who benefited? U.S. banks, including J.P. Morgan and Chase, organized asset sales and earned fees. American corporations expanded into British and imperial markets. Ford, GM, GE, Standard Oil, U.S. Government secured strategic bases and monetary dominance. IMF and World Bank, founded in 1944, institutionalized the system globally. Britain's loss became America's framework. Britain as the template. The mechanisms applied to Britain became standard practice. Crisis loan conditions, asset sales, currency, liberalization, long-term dependency. This model would later be applied to over 80 countries through IMF programs. Britain was not an exception. It was the prototype. December 29, 2006, London. Inside the Bank of England, there is no ceremony, no flags, no speeches, no sense of closure. An electronic transfer clears quietly through the system. $83.25 million. With that final payment, a debt agreed 60 years earlier is extinguished. The war had ended in 1945. The payments ended in 2006. For most Britons, the moment passed unnoticed. Few connected that transaction to the bombed cities of the 1940s, the ration books, the lost colonies, or the slow retreat from global power. Yet in financial terms, this transfer marked the closing bracket on a transformation that had reshaped the modern world. Not the fall of an empire by force, but the absorption of an empire by system. The long shadow of a loan. The $3.75 billion loan was never just about money. Money is replaceable. Systems are not. What Britain surrendered between 1940 and 1946 was not merely gold, companies, or currency stability. It surrendered control over the rules by which power was measured. Before the war, Britain lived in a world it had designed. Sterling as a reserve currency, imperial preference, protecting trade, overseas investments, generating passive income, political power reinforced by financial independence. After the war, that world no longer existed. Britain did not collapse. It transitioned from architect to participant, from rule-maker to rule-taker. And that transition did not occur through invasion or revolution, but through documentation, conditions, and compliance. Why this mattered more than colonies. Empires can lose territory and recover. They cannot lose monetary sovereignty and remain empires. When Britain dismantled imperial preference, it surrendered the economic glue that bound its empire together. Colonies that once traded primarily within the British system were suddenly exposed to American industrial power, larger, cheaper, faster. The empire was no longer economically rational. Decolonization followed not because Britain suddenly rejected imperialism, but because it could no longer afford it. Financial gravity had shifted. The American moment. For the United States, this was not accidental. American policymakers did not wake up in 1945 and stumble into global dominance. They understood something previous empires had not fully grasped. Control the currency, and you don't need to control the territory. The dollar replaced sterling not because of ideology, but because of structure. Bretton Woods fixed the dollar at the center. IMF and World Bank enforced the rules. Loans replaced gunboats. Conditionality replaced conquest. The empire Britain once administered through governors and fleets was replaced by something quieter and far more durable. A financial order. The paradox of the Marshall Plan. History celebrates the Marshall Plan as generosity. And in many ways it was. Roughly $200 billion, today's money, rebuilt Europe. Factories restarted. Cities recovered. Former enemies were reintegrated. But there was a paradox buried inside that generosity. Germany, defeated, occupied, morally discredited, was rebuilt without repayment. Britain, victorious, exhausted, allied, paid for 6 decades. Why? Because Germany had no empire to dismantle. Britain did. And dismantling that empire was central to the new system. From Britain to the world. What happened to Britain did not remain unique. It became policy. From the late 1940s onward, the same mechanics were applied repeatedly. Latin America in the 1980s, Asia in the 1990s, Eastern Europe after the Cold War, Southern Europe after the financial crisis. Each case followed a familiar sequence. Crisis removes leverage loans, restore liquidity conditions, reshape the economy, assets. Our privatized currency, control is surrender, dependency become structural. Britain was simply the first test case, applied discreetly, successfully, and without resistance. Why Britain couldn't resist? Could Britain have refused? In theory, yes. In reality, no. Britain faced exhausted industry dollar shortages, war, debts, food insecurity, political instability. There was no alternative financial system to turn to. No rival reserve currency. No competing institution. The choice was compliance or collapse. And compliance does not look like defeat. It looks like agreement. The silence around financial power. Military defeat is loud. Financial subordination is quiet. No surrender documents. No occupying troops. No statues torn down. Only spreadsheets. That silence is why this story remains unfamiliar, even to those who lived through it. The mechanisms were technical, incremental, bureaucratic. But their impact was permanent. The enduring system. Today, the world still operates within the framework built between 1940 and 1946. Dollar-denominated trade, dollar-denominated debt institutions, enforcing liquidity, discipline crises, resolved through conditional lending. The actors change. The script does not. Britain was once convinced its empire made it indispensable. The post-war order proved otherwise. The final irony. Britain defeated Hitler. But it surrendered something more valuable than territory. It surrendered financial autonomy. Not because it was weak, but because it was dependent. And dependency, once established, reshapes everything that follows. Closing reflection. Empires rarely end the way people expect. Some fall in flames. Some dissolve in revolutions. And some simply sign the paperwork. The $3.75 billion loan did not end the British Empire on the day it was signed, but it locked in a process that made the empire economically unsustainable and ensured that global leadership would pass quietly, legally, and permanently into new hands. History remembers the battles, but power is often decided after the war, in rooms without windows, over numbers that never make headlines. Victory changes flags and borders. Finance decides who writes the future.